Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's about 6:45 a.m. and I'm walking through my classroom right now to shut the door so I don't feel awkward when I'm talking to my phone when no one else is here. Anyway, as you can see, I'm not here. I am here on the screen, but not here in reality, which is kind of deep when you think about it. But I'm at home. My wife has pneumonia. She went to the doctor on Saturday. They gave her antibiotics. And it's either, the bacteria of pneumonia or some nasty virus. And so she hasn't really been getting better. She was having some kind of wheezing and a lot of coughing last night. So we may be headed back to the doctor today. And I think my older kid's getting it now too. So we're trying to keep it away from the younger kid. He was the one who ended up in the hospital with it. So this is 3 cases of pneumonia in the last, 2 months. And that's 3 more cases of pneumonia than I've ever had in my family. So anyway, I plan to be back tomorrow, but I wanted to send you a little message and kind of talk through what you're going to be doing today. You've got computers, and so you're going to have the rest of the week to work as long as you're using that time. A couple years ago, I started adding in the work time for papers into class, and I've gotten better papers as a result, and more of them. So I'm happy to give it to you as long as you're using it. Outside of today, obviously, I will, during your work time, I'll come around and check in with you, each 2 or 3 times during the class and just make sure, make sure you get your questions answered and that you feel confident with what you're doing and that you know where you're headed with it. So anyway, I expect to hear a good report from the sub that you used this time, especially since the odds of you wanting to work on this paper over winter break are very small. I think it might be a toss-up between the odds of me growing a tail or the odds of you wanting to work on your paper over break. Now, the caveat to that is if my experiments pay off, I may have that tail sooner than you think. Okay, that's enough of that. Anyway, so please work. You're going to get a handout today. I will share this with you tomorrow. I just didn't have a chance to do that. And it looks like this. Those are the 3 kind of general essay topics. I want to make sure that's on the screen. 3 kind of general essay topics. You can take a look at your own that we kind of talk through. And Holden's Symbolic Journey, kind of to adulthood. What the book argues for, it can be, as we kind of talk through, we've got an argument for arguing for authenticity. We also have an argument of arguing for the importance of communication. And then the last one is explaining how the symbols show that Holden's changed. Okay, so early when we, last try when we were working on just working with text, I talked about the stapler, right, and not explaining the stapler, so with the, if you remember that. For the symbols, the goal of this is not to explain what the symbol means, right, because that's explaining the symbol. You're explaining how the author's using the symbol to show how he changes, right? So it's, you wouldn't say, and I desperately do not want to hear this, Holden's red hunting hat is not a security blanket. Okay, so if I see that in any of your papers, it will mean that you weren't paying attention to me as I talked to you about this and you just looked up answers online. So it's a little test for you. Anyway, you wouldn't just say the red hunting hat equals this, okay, because the hat's in there and it means one thing in the beginning. If you look at the context of when he bought it, and then he starts to wear it differently throughout, and then by the end he's wearing it in a different way, right? And the difference between how he wore it in the beginning and how he wore it at the end, that's a point that the author's making and a way the author's using to demonstrate how he changes. Right? So with this, hopefully you were taking notes as you read. That was and is still an assignment. What I would do is on your computer, like I said, I'll share this with you tomorrow, but I just went through and kind of broke this up into different topics. Okay, so what I would do first before you do anything, because hopefully you've got a lot of notes. So for instance, if you're writing about communication, I would start brainstorming, right? And look at the times he's wanted to talk, right, which hopefully you've written down, and the times that he did find someone to talk to, right, and you would do some brainstorming about what his problem is. And then once you kind of lay this out, you're trying to prove how he learns the importance of communication, right? So then you would lay out the thing, if you were trying to prove that to me about the book, what topics would you bring up? Right? So the problem he had and when he starts to talk and then what he learns from it. Then once I would lay those out on my Word document, right? So I would have one heading for what his whole problem is initially. That would be topic 1, right? And then I would do times he really wanted to talk. Those would be topics, 2, 3, 4. And then the people at the end, especially that he talks to and actually learns things from, right? Then once I have those laid out, and you can do that for the other ones too, right? For the symbols, you would lay out each symbol. So I would type up red hunting hat, and then I would find the evidence of the times why he bought it originally, right? I would type that up. I would type up page numbers of where he refused to wear it, right? And then the big one at the end when he finally wears it. With the ducks, I would then do another section for the ducks, and I would brainstorm, talk a little bit about the context of when he was talking to Mr. Spencer. Right? I would bring up one or two of the other times he talks about the ducks, and then the cab driver who gives him the good advice, and then where he investigates it on his own at the end. And for authenticity, right, you could talk about in the beginning how he thinks everyone's phony, kind of set that up. And then people he talks to who he finds to be authentic and what he could learn from them, and then how we know he's changed at the end. Right? And so what you're doing is you're just kind of doing some brainstorming about if you were going to try to prove this, knowing what you do about the book, what would the topics be you would have to cover, right? Then what I would do is look through your quotes. So if you're writing about the red hunting hat, I would look through your evidence and write down all those quotes. I would type them up underneath in your Word document, underneath the section that said red hunting hat. A little tip you can do, as we talked about last try, I think you can find a full text PDF version of this online if you just put in quotation marks, Catcher in the Rye, full text, maybe PDF, and then you should be able to hit Control F and you can start to find those quotes that you wrote down, right? So you don't need to type everything up. If you can do this kind of thinking in advance where you think through what your argument's going to be and all the evidence you're going to use to prove it, it's more work on the front end, but then when you sit down to write your paper, you know what you're going to write about and the order you're going to write it in and all the evidence you're going to use to prove it. And writing it's actually pretty easy by that point because you've done all the hard work. My guess is you know the experience of not doing that kind of pre-thinking and you sit down you haven't done any thinking about your paper and you just sit down and start writing. And what happens is whatever idea comes into your head comes out on the screen, right? You just type it onto the screen. And the problem with that is then your argument kind of starts to wander because it's just like, this is a good idea, I'll put that in. Here's another good idea, I'll put that in. And so you won't really know how your paper's going until you get to the end and see how it works out. If you do the brainstorming and think through the topics you could bring up, right, and then the evidence from the quotes you could use to prove it, you'll have a sense of how your paper's going to go. If you have a lot to say, you'll know that you're in good shape. If you feel like you're struggling even in the brainstorming to come up with things to write about, maybe this isn't a good topic for you to write about because you don't have enough to say about it, right? And by doing that kind of pre-thinking in advance and outlining in advance, then you save yourself the hassle and the time of trying to write a paper that isn't going to work. Also, and maybe further, when you get to college, if you have a big paper, a midterm or final due, and you go to your professor during their office hours and you'd say, this is what I'd like to write about, these are the topics I'm going to cover, this is some of the evidence I'm going to use, what do you think? A, they will be very impressed, and B, they will be able to tell you whether your paper is going to work or not, and C, if you can then take that paper home and execute that paper, you are, I think, ahead of the ball game and will be in very good shape for college, right? So I think that this is, while, again, as I said, it's a little more work on the front end, I think it will save you time on when you start to write the paper. So anyway, I've kind of rambled on about this enough, so make sure you're using your time. Try to have something done when I come to class tomorrow, okay? Have some type of outline done or have written something. One other little tip for you, if you feel like you know what you're going to write about and the brainstorming's gone well, don't feel like you need to start with the introduction. For me, sometimes starting with the introduction is the hardest part, and also for me, when I'm sitting to write and I have to look at the blank screen and flashing cursor, and I'm not typing anything, I feel like I'm wasting my time, right? But if you feel like there's a part after you've done your kind of pre-thinking and outlining, if you feel like there's a part that you could write, so you know what you're going to say about when Holden gets the red hunting hat after the fencing incident, and you could just start typing that, or get through a couple, 2 incidents involving the red hat, start with that, type it up in 20 minutes, and then be done. Then use some time when you're not writing or not sitting down at your computer to think about what the next part of your argument's going to be. If you could get through the red hunting hat today or tomorrow, and then that night be thinking about the things you'd say with the ducks and the evidence you'd use, then the next day, and then you can crank out the duck section pretty quickly. That's a strange sentence.